But in a football game, or in any kind of sports ball game, 34-0 is a blowout. The zero side isn't just beaten, they're usually embarrassed. But lucky for Diddy, trials are not football games, and calling 0 defense witnesses to the prosecution's 34 witnesses and then promptly resting, that can mean one of two very different things. It might mean we got nothing, or it might mean you got nothing, meaning the feds, you got nothing. A lot of court watchers thought that Diddy himself might actually take the stand, believing that he could outperform the government's 34 witnesses and then some. But that did not happen. This did. Wow. You see it like that, you really do feel it, right? You feel all 7 weeks of trial. 34 witnesses in 7 weeks. Instead, we got the next best thing in this sex trafficking, racketeering trial. We got Diddy doing his damnedest to charm the pants off the judge in this courtroom today. A judge who spoke to Diddy first, asking him, how you feeling? And Puff Daddy, you know, being Puff Daddy, answered, quote, I'm doing great, Your Honor. I've been wanting to tell you, thank you. You're doing an excellent job, end quote. To which the judge replied, thank you, I appreciate it. I don't often hear a defendant stand up and say that, but I don't often see a defendant like Diddy. For their part, his legal team moved immediately to throw the whole case out, claiming that the prosecutors over there did not come close to meeting their burden of proof for this trial. Newsflash, that is almost standard operating procedure after prosecutors rest their case. And if your lawyer doesn't throw that Hail Mary, time to get a new lawyer. For his part, the judge did not rule on Diddy's lawyer's request to toss it all out. But you just wait for it. It's coming. Yeah. Lawyers actually have to come back to the court tomorrow without the rest of us all there so that they can hammer out all the jury instructions. So, yeah, you're probably going to get that ruling tomorrow. And I'm going to bet my house, judge says, fat chance. Those are my words, but that's effectively what I think is going to happen. And speaking of the government's case, the feds rested with yet another mountain of receipts today, as well as text messages and video clips of and about the events they call freak-offs. But the witnesses have called hotel nights, or sometimes king nights, or even wild king nights. And over the weekend, they released pages and pages of internal messages. I mean, this stuff was gold, Jerry. Diddy's staff members, like, furiously texting each other, what they needed to get to make things absolutely perfect for their boss, no matter how gross the requests. In one message, an assistant named Joey Chavez writes, and I quote, need more BO, that's baby oil, and AG, that's Astroglide, tomorrow, before everybody leaves. And then another staffer named Frank Butler on the chat responds, just packed 30 bottles of baby oil. Joey, exactly how much do we need? And Joey's answer, as much as possible. I can't even imagine being on this text chain. And then that same Joey later on asks, what's our BO/AG count? That's, you know, baby oil and Astroglide count. And then Frank replies, 30 plus on each. Then comes this message about Diddy's girlfriend, again from the name Frank Butler. Quote, we need to put Jane on payroll if she ain't already. And you know that Jane is, of course, that alleged victim, right? Ex-girlfriend of Diddy's, who testified at length under a pseudonym. Her real name in the original text, we redacted it out, right? It just says Jane. And some texts are super duper explicit. A Diddy assistant writes, okay, I need to refresh her bag of blanks. Oh my God, it's actually up there on the screen. Okay, so I can't say that, but I need to refresh her bag of blanks and send to her. The her in that message also appears to be Jane, and Frank Butler adds, need the sex luggages and light, which I think means lights, because they talked a lot about having tons and tons of red lights in the hotel rooms for these freaky, freak-off king nights, wild king nights, whatever you call them. And then this one. I say this a lot, but I really mean it this time. Get a whiskey for this one, or make sure you just don't do a spit take. because this next one involves the excessive lube and baby oil that must have been going down in those hotel rooms, because this is a message post-freak-off. KK, who you'll know by now is Diddy's ex-chief of staff, Christina Coram, texts this question: how's the cleanup going? To which Joey, the poor, long-suffering assistant, responds, slipped and fell twice. Ugh. I don't know if that's a joke or serious, because honestly, with 1,000 bottles of lube and baby oil, it could have been serious, could have been real. Later on, KK sends out a week-long operations plan to the team. Jane is scheduled for multiple, quote, Wild King nights, while the team is instructed to be fully staffed and standing by, both for Diddy's meetup with Jane, but then also for the meetup with the next girlfriend, the rapper Young Miami. She's arriving immediately afterwards. Or maybe there's crossover. I don't know. It's Diddy. I'm going to rest my case right now. I'm going to bring in my guests, Maria Cruz Melendez. She's a former federal prosecutor who handled multiple organized crime cases, in particular the R. Kelly conviction, which, may I remind you, was sex trafficking and racketeering in the Southern District. And Sara Azari is a criminal defense attorney and NewsNation legal analyst, and also one of our favorites. Ladies, so good to have you both. I cannot wait for this conversation. Maria, Diddy's team bailed. They decided they were not going to mount a case. They were not going to, well, they put a few things on the record, but they weren't going to call a single witness. Do you believe, with all of your background and experience, that they really did think the government didn't meet its burden? Or do you believe that they couldn't find an unimpeachable witness to get up there and sing Diddy's praises without risk of the prosecution tearing them to ribbons?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, they're weighing whether or not they can make the arguments that they want to make on closing without giving access to the prosecution, to witnesses where they could make additional points. And so is it possible that they had a number of witnesses that could have provided helpful information? I think that's absolutely the case. But to use your word, would they have been unimpeachable? Probably not. I think they would have given access to the prosecution to make additional points. And you mentioned earlier the fact that the defense doesn't have a burden. They don't need to put a case on. And so I think at the end of the day, what they're going to end up relying on is the fact that they think the government hasn't met each and every one of the elements that they're supposed to meet.
So, Sara, I know from watching so much of your coverage, you have not felt at any point in this trial, to my knowledge, that the prosecution has mounted a racketeering and sex trafficking case. I don't know if you feel the same way about transportation for the purpose of prostitution, but do you really believe that the prosecution hasn't met its burden?
Ashleigh, look, it takes one juror to agree with me, and he's not guilty of sex trafficking and racketeering. And I think that they're definitely overreaching on the racketeering. It's just putting Jane on, having 2 victims going missing. Remember that this jury, when they go to deliberate, they're not going to just be focused on what evidence was presented, but what evidence is missing. Where did those 2 other victims go? Where is Christina Coram, who's been referenced in text messages and is clearly a co-conspirator? So I don't think they have him on that. I do think that they've met their burden beyond a reasonable doubt on the prostitution. We've got male escorts being flown around for the purposes of sex across state lines, and I think that that's a clear thing. But, you know, if I was the defense, Ashleigh, I wouldn't be mad at that charge, right? Because that helps the jury get this really bad guy on something and don't let him walk out unscathed. So I kind of like the prostitution charge in the mix as a defense attorney. When I've got these kinds of facts, I don't think they've met their burden on the sex trafficking either. And remember, you know, we've got 2 different kinds of victims. We have a Jane victim and then we have a Cassie victim, and they're different dynamics, they're different relationships. One's vulnerable, one's actually, to me, an equal, Jane is. And I think this is going to be a hard, daunting task for this jury to think, were these women not just adults who were consenting to this freaky lifestyle, or was this really coercion?
So I'm glad you brought that up because, Maria, I would love you to weigh in on this. All the way along, I have felt like Cassie was beaten into submission from the evidence that I saw. She just tried to go to a party once, and she was yanked out by her hair and beaten black and blue just for going to a party. God forbid she leave the man. So I feel as though the terror was real for Cassie, that she had to perform lest she deal with that, you know, on a regular basis. And when I say regular, many of the witnesses could not count how many times they saw her beaten and black and blue. But Jane was different. She had a $10,000 a month apartment that she didn't want to lose. Does that matter to these jurors? Or could they just say, I see sex trafficking with Cassie, I don't see it with Jane, but that is still a predicate act for racketeering?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I agree with Sarah in that the Mann Act, the prostitution charges are likely to see a conviction with those. But Jane is different in terms of the relationship, and I think that's where the defense has poked the most holes in the government's case in their cross-examination of Jane. And so I do think there's a stark comparison between the two of them. And so the jury can decide at the end of the day. Count 2 is the sex trafficking with regard to Cassie Ventura, so they're going to find him guilty on that. I think it's likely they'll find guilty, as we mentioned, on the Mann Act stuff. The RICO is sort of a toss-up because I do think it hinges on their ability to show that there was a co-conspirator. And I think the defense counsel has an opportunity to say here, we didn't see Christina Coram, if this is the co-defendant, or the co-conspirator. We didn't see Christina Coram testify here, and there's not enough evidence to show this. So I think we could see a split verdict. We could very much so see a situation where they look at Jane and they say, you were a consenting adult. There are lots of text messages that suggest that you either enjoyed it or perhaps maybe it wasn't your cup of tea, but you did it because you were his girlfriend and you did it because you wanted to please him and because you loved him, not because you were scared of the consequences of not doing it.
There is that financial fear, though, that he was dangling over her head in several messages saying, I can take that apartment away at any time. We both can stop what we do in this contract at any time. So I do wonder how the jurors will feel about that. But
that's a form of coercion.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But defense counsel...
Hold on, start with what you were saying, Maria. You said that was a form of... Go ahead.
That is financial... constraints and coercion is one of the ways that they can prove their case, 100%. And if the jury is convinced of that, then the government can use that versus fear of physical attack. But during cross-examination, defense counsel was able to show that if Jane wanted to leave at any moment, she was financially secure and she could have supported herself and wasn't 100% dependent on Sean Combs. And so I do think there's room for reasonable doubt with respect to Jane and the sex trafficking.
Well, that's what I thought, Sarah, because she was a model, right? She was an OnlyFans model making $10K before she met Diddy.
Right. I don't know how much money she was making as an OnlyFans model, but she had a 3-month security deposit on that $10,000 a month. Let me tell you, I'm from LA. That's a lot of rent in LA, okay? And that's, you know, she wanted providers. She liked men to pay for her. That's a choice, right? And as much as Diddy was holding up the rent card, I'm going to pull the rent if you don't do this and that, don't get on your job, you know, in one of the text messages, she was pulling the hotel night card, essentially saying, if you don't get back here from that vacation you're taking with this other woman that I'm jealous of, you're not going to get a hotel night. So there was very much, I did not see a power dynamic at play in this relationship. I very much saw her as somebody who stands her ground, is a first aggressor in an altercation that they had. She's the one that attacks him first. So she's not the same person to me. There's really a split screen between her and Cassie. With Cassie, we have, a control. She was younger. She was vulnerable. We have control of her career. We have control of her, like you said, her who she hangs out with, what she does, or, there was a lot more control there. And honestly, look, to Maria's point, they could find him not guilty as to Jane, sex trafficking Jane, but guilty as to Cassie. I mean, he's still doomed, so... I think this would ultimately, if he's sentenced on sex trafficking, they would run concurrently. So at the end of the day, guilty on one is the same as guilty on two.
And that, I hate putting people to the test with math on command, but Maria, I'm going to do it. If there's a guilty verdict for Cassie's sex trafficking, and they do see that it falls into the rubric of RICO, and of course the Mann Act, the transportation for the purposes of prostitution, which I agree, I think that one's dead to rights. What would he serve for that? What's the possibility there, Maria?
So the sex trafficking, the way they've charged it, carries a 15-year mandatory minimum. And with RICO, it can go up to 20 years. And as Sara mentioned, there's a likelihood of that running concurrently. And so we could see as much as a 20-year sentence. But ultimately, it'll be up to the judge whether or not they think any mitigating factors exist. But if he's convicted on the sex trafficking, 15 years mandatory minimum.
Well, and I think, Ashleigh, look,
I mean,
the
that's
defense
a
here,
55-year-old man, right?
Right. It's the rest of his life. But the defense here is consent, obviously. Money grab is the defense's star witness. And then don't forget the drugs. There was a lot of testimony elicited on cross-examination about whether or not he was under the influence when he did all these bad things, the blackmailing, the threats, the forced labor, and all these things. And so that matters, not just at sentencing as a mitigating factor, which is huge at federal sentencing, but also in closing arguments, that the man that you would think is guilty of these things is not that man. That man was a monster on drugs. I expect the defense to argue that heavily.
I have yet to see a DUI case where it was like, well, I was really drunk. I didn't mean to kill them.
No, it's not it's not a defense, but it's an explanation. Look, we got to explain it.
You know
We're
how I
defense
feel.
lawyers.
You guys both have to come back because this has been one of the more insightful discussions that I have seen on this case, and I just can't stand when people throw their attitudes out there, but without backing it up. So thank you both, Maria Cruz Melendez
and I really
and Sara
liked
Azari.
Maria. I thought she was a straight prosecutor. I appreciate those prosecutors.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. Come back.
Girl power. All right, thanks, ladies. We'll have you both back.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.